I want to thank our witnesses for joining us. We apologize for the delay. It happens here. Sometimes we have clusters of votes, and normally, of course, you have to sit and listen to us talk at you for far too long, so we're going to dispense with that so we can hear people who know what they're talking about, which is actually theoretically the purpose of a hearing on Capitol Hill. And so I will recognize Mr. Inglis, who I think is going to say the same thing, and then we'll hear from our witnesses.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, looking forward to hearing from the witnesses.
I thank the gentleman for his eloquent speech. With that, it's my privilege to introduce our outstanding panel of witnesses who bring great expertise. Dr. Robert Magnian, and if I mispronounce, please forgive me, is the director of the Center for Sponsored Coastal Ocean Research at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Ms. Suzanne Schwartz is acting director of the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds of the U.S. EPA. Mr. Dan Ayres hails from my home state. Good to see you again, Dan. A coastal shellfish manager and lead biologist at the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife Region 6 office. Dr. Donald Anderson is senior scientist and director of the Coastal Ocean Institute at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Dr. Greg L. Boyer is professor of biochemistry at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry and director of Great Lakes Research Consortium. And Dr. Donald Scavia, did I pronounce it properly? Scavia, thank you, is a Graham Family Professor of Environmental Sustainability and Professor of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan, a state from whence hails our delightful Dr. Ayres, who has been a passionate advocate of this. I should also mention that Connie Mack and Kathy Castor of Florida both have been very strong advocates of that. As witnesses should know, we'll have 5 minutes for spoken testimony. Those of you who are dying to hear what Mr. Inglis and I were going to say can find those on our websites. Don't rush out and bookmark that right now. With that, let's hear from Dr. Magnian and the rest of our distinguished panel.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Robert Magnian. I'm director of NOAA's Center for Sponsored Coastal Ocean Research. In this role, I administer on behalf of the Department of Commerce and NOAA the 5 national programs on harmful algal blooms and hypoxia that are authorized by the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research Control Act of 1998. I also coordinate these programs nationally and internationally. NOAA views hypoxia and harmful algal blooms, or HABs, as significant threats to the health of the American public and the U.S. economy. HABs, which now occur in all states, are a growing problem worldwide. They threaten human and ecosystem health and the vitality of fish and shellfish, protected species, and coastal economies. They threaten, similarly, hypoxia, or areas of low dissolved oxygen called dead zones, have increased 30-fold since 1960. They now occur in over 300 U.S. coastal systems, including the Great Lakes, signaling severe degradation of water quality and habitats nationwide. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on the draft reauthorization so that we can build upon the many successes of this legislation. In 1998, Hypoxia authorized NOAA to take action to address the growing problems of HABs and hypoxia and coordinate interagency efforts. A major component of this responsibility is NOAA's leadership of the nation's only competitive research programs focused solely on these issues, 3 for HABs and 2 for hypoxia. Hypoxia also authorizes NOAA to carry out intramural research and assessment activities. Active areas of research include HAB and hypoxia forecasting, development of new methods for HAB cell and toxin detection, and understanding the impacts of HABs and hypoxia on aquatic life and coastal economies. The 2004 reauthorization required 5 reports. 4 have been submitted to Congress, and the 5th is undergoing interagency approval. Many significant research advances supported by Hypoxia programs have greatly improved HAB and hypoxia management. These accomplishments are described in the Hypoxia reports that were submitted to Congress and in my written testimony. Let me just highlight 2. HAB forecasting has been extended to new areas, an outcome of many years of sustained research, and shows great promise in providing early warning to public health and resource managers. Forecasts in the western Gulf of Mexico, the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Maine, Chesapeake Bay, the Pacific Northwest are in various stages of development. NOAA has preliminary plans for a national HAB forecasting system which will make routine forecasts, like weather forecasts, in areas where HABs are a major threat. In 2008, the Interagency Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Nutrient Task Force updated the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan, which reaffirmed the goal of reducing the hypoxic zone and prescribed 45% reductions in both nitrogen and phosphorus. The recommendations were based in large part on the many years of NOAA-funded research authorized by Hypoxia. Regarding the draft bill, it addresses two issues that are consistent with NOAA goals. First, it will establish an overarching HAB and hypoxia program within NOAA. This will enhance the visibility of these issues as a national priority and improve coordination within NOAA and with other federal agencies. Secondly, regional research and action plans will be developed with input from local experts and managers. These plans will guide future research priorities toward development of products that are of greatest benefit to those on the front lines of managing these threats as well as the public. We note, however, that all mention of specific ongoing HAB and hypoxia programs that were identified in prior versions of Hypoxia have been removed. NOAA has found that specification of programs helps to clarify the intent of Congress when implementing this legislation. Much of the nation's progress in improving HAB and hypoxia management and response has come from information and products developed under these highly successful programs. Further, one of the Hypoxia reports presented to Congress last year, called HAB Management and Response, recommended that progress would be enhanced if event response and infrastructure programs were added. Finally, the role of research within NOAA is not specified in the draft legislation as it was in the previously enacted legislation. Such authorization assures that the valuable research conducted within NOAA will be continued. We understand that this bill is only a draft, so we would welcome additional opportunities to work with the committee to develop the language of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, for this opportunity to comment on the pending legislation and update you on NOAA's programs. NOAA strongly supports reauthorization of Hypoxia and the new opportunities it will provide. I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Suzanne Schwartz, the Acting Director of the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds within the Office of Water at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I would also like to introduce now to you Dr. Rick Green of our Office of Research and Development, who is sitting behind me, who is the agency's technical expert on the subject of hypoxia and harmful algal blooms. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss some of the things that EPA is doing to address the threats to human health and our marine and freshwater resources from harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. Obviously, everyone here knows the problems associated with harmful algal blooms. I would, however, just note that the second largest hypoxic zone in the world is located in the northern Gulf of Mexico, not something we are proud of. There is very strong evidence connecting hypoxia and algal blooms with nutrient pollution, excessive nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, with the most significant sources of nutrients coming from agricultural runoff as well as residential and commercial fertilizers, animal waste, sewage treatment plants, and air deposition from utilities and vehicles. And EPA's focus, while we have done research, has largely been to look at ways to control the sources of this pollution. EPA has statutory authority under the Clean Water Act and the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act to protect oceans and coastal waters, as well as freshwater lakes, rivers, and streams. We have a number of programs under the Clean Water Act that look specifically to regulating discharges into waters of the United States and establishing limits for pollutants that can go into waters of the U.S. We regulate discharges of sewage from vessels as well as discharges of other materials. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we promulgate drinking water standards for the protection of human health from exposure to contaminants. It's clear that the discharges of nitrogen and phosphorus and their effect on the development of hypoxia and harmful algal blooms is a problem now more than ever. In response, since the introduction of Hypoxia, we have worked to adopt a watershed approach to reducing nutrient discharges that involves identifying high-priority watersheds and applying both voluntary and regulatory tools to achieve water quality goals. In the Mississippi River Basin states, EPA has approved a total of about 3,500 nutrient-related TMDLs, total maximum daily loads. which identify the maximum amount of pollutant that a water body can receive and still achieve water quality standards. We are also working closely with the states on developing nutrient management and nutrient reduction strategies. Just today, EPA is seeking public input on a draft nutrient TMDL for the Chesapeake Bay, which, again, we will be looking at innovative ways to address the non-point sources in particular, as well as the point sources that are causing the problems. We also have non-point source grant program and other grant programs where we provide some financial assistance for nutrient management. We're working with the states on assessing the nation's waters. National Lake Assessments Report, which is due for release in December, will include for the first time the occurrence of microcystin, the most commonly measured algal toxin, in lakes across the country. The surveys will provide information on nutrient levels in our waters as well. EPA is also working with the states to support the development of numeric nutrient water quality standards. We are engaged in rulemaking for that purpose in Florida. We are carefully considering our response to a petition to do the same in the Mississippi at Chafalaya River Basin. And we've just recently provided to EPA's Science Advisory Board methodologies for states to use in developing their own nutrient criteria. EPA has a long history of doing research, whether it's in the Great Lakes, through the EcoHab program, and through other programs. We are also in the process of reviewing the addition of algal toxins on the candidate contaminant list for drinking water. We have worked with EPA's Science Advisory Board as well as the National Academy of Sciences, and I would just highlight that they found that while the Clean Water Act had much reduced direct discharges from point sources into the Mississippi River, problems stemming from urban runoff, agriculture, and other non-point sources have proven difficult to address. This is an issue that confronts EPA because our statutory authority is focused primarily on point source pollution, and we have limited regulatory authorities over non-point source pollution. The Office of Research and Development is working to guide the science on Gulf hypoxia and nutrient management decisions, to help forecast the effects of nutrient management actions that are taken, and provide options to guide restoration and decision making. As part of the task forces, we have been actively participating as well, and we chair the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force. In conclusion, EPA is an active participant in research and control of freshwater and marine hypoxia and harmful algal blooms, and particularly their primary cause, excess nutrients. We appreciate the subcommittee's efforts in this area. We look forward to working with you further on the bill. We do have some comments that I won't provide at this time, and I thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Schwartz. Mr. Ayres.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As a Washington State coastal shellfish manager, I'm here today to represent the many state and tribal fishery managers, aquaculture industry members, and human health experts who, like me, work hard to manage important shellfish resources, allowing for the maximum socioeconomic value these resources can provide to the small communities along the Washington coast. We each have responsibility in our respective areas to manage the harvest of the bountiful natural resources we've been blessed with in the Pacific Northwest. The West Coast aquaculture industry, which produces a large portion of the nation's oysters, mussels, and hard-shell clams, is valued at more than $110 million annually. In an average year, landings in the West Coast Dungeness crab fishery have a value just to the fishermen of between $25 to $45 million, making this fishery an important coastal economic driver for the hundreds of licensed fishers, both state and tribal, and many more people involved in shoreside processing operations. And the fishery that I know so well, Washington State's recreational razor clam fishery, that draws very large numbers of participants from great distances to the small communities along our coast during the October to May period when few visitors would otherwise be present. The 2008-09 season recorded just under 250,000 digger trips and generated an estimated $12.5 million to the many small tourist-related coastal businesses. However, all of us find our job is made much more difficult by the ever-present threat of harmful algal species that are naturally occurring in the waters of the West Coast and the potential harm they pose to human health. When the growth of these species bloom and produce dangerous toxins, then the fisheries we manage are disrupted, and the activities and income of those who depend on them are greatly impacted. This last winter, NOAA hosted the first ever West Coast Harmful Algal Bloom Summit. This three-day workshop in Portland, Oregon brought together West Coast scientists, state and tribal fishery managers, human health experts, and aquaculture industry members to design a West Coast Regional HAB monitoring, alert, and response network, as well as a West Coast Regional HAB forecasting network. In addition, workshop participants also began developing a West Coast HAB research and action plan. Joining regional expert scientists and managers to address regional HAB problems is very valuable. The solutions to these problems can best be found within each region with the help, support, and guidance of federal agencies. We applaud NOAA's efforts, along with representatives of the West Coast Governor's Agreement on Ocean Health, to organize and execute the West Coast HAB Summit. Direction to federal agencies to continue to organize and fund regional workshops that result in regional HAB research action plans around the nation should be an integral part of future legislation. In 2007, I participated in a NOAA-sponsored workshop that brought together a group of HAB researchers and coastal managers from all around the nation to provide input into the National Scientific Research Development, Demonstration, and Technology Transfer Plan on Reducing Impacts from Harmful Algal Blooms, the RIDIT Plan. The major result was the call for 3 new federal programs. First, a program that focuses on methods for prevention, control, and mitigation of HABs. Second, a comprehensive national HAB event response program. And third, a core infrastructure program. While we see all 3 programs as important to move the nation ahead in addressing HAB-related issues, as a state fishery manager, I worked hard on the HAB event response program. Today, we want to strongly encourage you to consider this as a potential new program the federal agencies are directed to implement. Such a program will improve access to existing resources for better response through information sharing, communication, coordination, and provide essential new resources. However, by improving our national response to regional HAB events is only half the battle. We want to encourage you to include in any future HAB legislation support for continued research into ways to mitigate for and someday actually prevent HAB events. The other 2 programs proposed in the RIDIT plan will certainly move the nation in that direction. The Prevention, Control, and Mitigation program will focus on moving promising technologies and strategies that arise through basic research programs, from development to demonstration to technology transfer for field application by managers. The Core Infrastructure program will increase availability of adequate analytical facilities, research and reference materials, technical training, and access to data. Finally, in reviewing the committee's draft legislation for the reauthorization of the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Act, we are very concerned that 2 key existing HAB programs administered by NOAA are not specifically identified. On the Washington coast, we are now enjoying the results from the work of 2 important projects that were funded through these programs: the Monitoring and Event Response for Harmful Algal Bloom, the MERHAB program, and Ecology and Oceanography of Harmful Algal Blooms, the EcoHAB program. My written testimony includes specific examples of why these programs should be continued. So, in the end, the ability to predict the onset of these harmful algal blooms, to better respond on a region-wide basis, and to find innovative ways to mitigate and even prevent them will be a huge step forward in allowing us to better accomplish our mission to provide our citizens access to some of the best seafood in the world. Thank you.
Chairman Baird and Ranking Member Inglis, my name is Don Anderson. I'm a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where I direct the U.S. National Office for Harmful Algal Blooms. I'm also co-chair of the National HAB Committee and have been actively involved in research on HABs and in formulating our national HAB program. I was asked to talk about technologies used to mitigate and control HABs. Mitigation is a term that includes well-proven strategies such as monitoring programs for toxins in shellfish, public education and outreach, scientifically based siting of aquaculture facilities, and other activities that reduce HAB impacts. In a major advance for the U.S., we are now forecasting HABs over timescales ranging from weeks to months. For example, an EcoHab program in the Pacific Northwest has identified an eddy, or a circulating water mass, off Puget Sound that serves as an incubator for the toxic cells that cause amnesic shellfish poisoning. This is a debilitating illness that can cause death or permanent memory loss in some victims. As the water spins off of that eddy, it carries cells to shore, causing sudden and significant outbreaks that are now easier to manage given this understanding. On the East Coast, again with EcoHab and MERHAB support, we have taken forecasting a step further and now have computer models that allow us to evaluate conditions that caused past outbreaks, but we can also look forward with forecasts. For the last 2 years, we successfully forecast major regional red tides months in advance and have provided weekly forecasts as well. And the value of this information is evident in the commitment by Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire to pay nearly $500,000 million for the collection of data needed to initiate these forecasts for the next 2 years. Another important mitigation tool relies on DNA probes for identifying and enumerating HAB species. And in a very exciting development, this technology is now being incorporated into robotic instruments that can be deployed remotely, collecting water and conducting the manipulations needed to detect and count HAB cells and measure their toxins. This brings us one step closer to a dream that I share with many in my field, arrays of instruments deployed along a coast that can detect HABs, monitor their development, and provide real-time data to the computer models that then predict landfall and impacts. This is the approach used by the Weather Service to provide accurate weather forecasts. There are significant challenges to do this with biological systems in the ocean, but I think we are up to that challenge. In the area of control of marine HABs, I'm afraid progress has been regrettably slow. This is not for lack of strategies, as there are methods to kill HAB cells using bacteria, parasites, viruses, chemicals, or even minerals such as clay that can be sprayed over a bloom to capture the toxic cells and carry them to bottom sediments. The stumbling block has been transitioning these laboratory studies to the field. And why is this? One reason is that, given a choice, scientists will propose fundamental research on bloom dynamics, for example, rather than undertake the risky, controversial, and highly visible task of trying to control a bloom. Another reason is that we do not have a separate program with its own funding line, and yet another is that we have no agency that currently has a clear mandate to control marine nuisance organisms, just like the Agricultural Research Service has for control of terrestrial pests. To jumpstart progress, this HBARCA legislation needs to explicitly call for a program on prevention, control, and mitigation of HABs and authorize funds for that specific program. If the funding is significant and targeted, scientists and engineers will participate and move this field forward. This is also an area where the HAB community should work with those who seek to manage invasive species, or with agencies such as the Agricultural Research Service. A related comment is that we need to authorize 2 other programs as detailed in my written testimony and as you've also heard so far today. One is a national HAB event response program and the other an infrastructure program. The need for the former was clearly evident this year when a red tide closed shellfish beds in Maine, New Hampshire, and much of Massachusetts, leading to requests to NOAA from Senator Snowe and from the FDA for information on the offshore extent and status of the bloom. This led to a scramble for funds to support cruises and personnel on a very short notice. Had there been a national program of event response, this would have been much more effective and timely. I will close by saying that I'm strongly supportive of the involvement of EPA in a national HAB program, and the inclusion of freshwater HABs is important as well. This committee has, I believe, shown great foresight and initiative in recognizing this need and acting upon it. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my testimony.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Inglis, Thank you for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. My name is Greg Boyer, and I'm a professor of biochemistry at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and director of New York's Great Lakes Research Consortium. I've worked on harmful algal blooms for more than 35 years, including marine and freshwater toxins. But today I'd like to specifically address freshwater harmful algal blooms in this draft legislation. The written testimonies provided will expand on many of the facts and details, so let me briefly review just a few key points. Marine and freshwater blooms are caused by the very rapid growth of microscopic plant-like organisms. But unlike marine systems, most freshwater blooms are caused by blue-green algae, which is actually a photosynthetic bacteria. This makes them similar but not identical to their marine counterparts, and so therefore some of the treatment options will be the same, but many of the approaches for prevention, control, and mitigation of these freshwater blooms will be different than those from marine systems. Some marine blooms produce very toxic compounds. Saxitoxin, a neurotoxin found in both marine and freshwater systems, is one of the most toxic non-protein toxins known and is a regulated biowarfare agent. Microcystins, a common liver toxin found in blooms in every state of the Union, goes by the trivial name of fast death factor. An outbreak in the Potomac River caused 5,000 to 8,000 cases of human gastrointestinal illness. Anatoxin-a, another neurotoxin produced by blue-green algae, goes by the trivial name of very fast death factor. A recent bloom in Lake Champlain resulted in the deaths of several family pets. These dogs barely made it off the beach before collapsing and dying in front of the family's children. Simply put, these are not nice compounds. Toxic blooms are becoming much more common and being reported in new locations each year. A recent study from my own laboratory found 50% of the samples collected from western Lake Erie over the last 5 years had measurable levels of toxin. That number is probably typical for any impacted water body in the United States. Our existing HAB research programs have been very successful for coastal waters. This is especially true for marine systems, where the interagency program EcoHab has made tremendous strides in understanding the ecology of harmful algal blooms in the western Gulf of Maine and in the Gulf of Mexico. Similarly, NOAA's MERHAB program has developed exciting new technologies for monitoring blooms both in the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes region. I'm also strongly supportive of the NOAA's new program in prevention, control, and mitigation. These programs need to be continued, and all three programs adequately funded so they can continue to provide for essential research in their respective areas. However, freshwater algal blooms offer an additional challenge. Most of the pictures you've been watching did not occur in the Great Lakes and are thus not under NOAA's jurisdiction. The Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act clearly give the U.S. EPA oversight of our nation's freshwater resources. Thus, U.S. EPA needs to be more actively involved in both development and implementation of a freshwater harmful algal bloom research and control program. The bill under discussion needs to provide clear direction to U.S. EPA as to their role. It needs to provide sufficient authority, and it needs to allocate funds necessary to carry out that work. It should clearly delineate U.S. EPA's responsibility for freshwater HABs and direct NOAA and the U.S. EPA to cooperatively administer the program where they have overlapping jurisdictions so that duplication can be avoided. I also want to emphasize that providing funds for extramural research is absolutely essential for the success of the HAB programs and the best way to harness the vast talents of the scientific community at large. Freshwater HABs adversely impact all segments of U.S. society, north, south, east, west, and in the middle, and their impacts on health, ecology, and economics of affected communities is large. These programs require a federally directed program with interagency cooperation and the recognition that different research will be needed for different areas. We cannot borrow from one program to pay for another. Therefore, I'd like to thank the committee for having the foresight to understand the gaps in our efforts and work towards trying to improve these nation's water quality, both in marine and freshwater systems. And with that, I'll end my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the opportunity to comment on the formulation of an action plan for harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. My name is Don Scavia. I'm the Graham Family Professor of Environmental Sustainability, as well as Professor of Natural Resources and Environment and Professor of Civil Engineering at the University of Michigan. Prior to joining Michigan's faculty 5 years ago, I also held several positions in NOAA, most recently as the Chief Scientist of the National Ocean Service. While there, I was responsible for implementing NOAA's portions of this statute and leading the assessments on behalf of the White House. I also directed the office that established several of the NOAA and interagency programs under the statute, including the EcoHab program, the MARHAB program, and the Northern Gulf of Mexico research program. While much has been accomplished in the past 10 years since enactment of the first law, much remains unfinished, and I'm pleased that the subcommittee is considering reauthorizing this act. Because the other witnesses have focused on harmful algal blooms, I'm going to focus my comments on the causes, consequences, and controls of hypoxia. In 2008, a report documented hypoxia for more than 400 ecosystems across the globe, affecting a total of more than 245,000 square kilometers. And most of those problems are driven by nutrient pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus. The U.S. National Assessment called for in this original statute reported in 2003 that 2/3 of the nation's estuaries showed symptoms of nutrient pollution, and a 2000 update of that study indicated that those conditions have not improved, and that worsening conditions are expected in 2/3 of our estuaries, with only about 20% potentially improving in the future. And again, the primary driver of this problem is the overloading of the system with nitrogen and phosphorus. If we consider three iconic systems, Lake Erie, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Gulf of Mexico, we see that while there's lots of year-to-year variability, the dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf have not gotten smaller, even after decades of research, management discussions, and plans. And the dead zone in Lake Erie, once thought to be under control and shrinking, has grown again to sizes that we haven't seen for decades. Clearly, the nutrient pollution problem is not under control, and if more is not done to reduce this pollution, we can expect further degradation of our coastal and Great Lakes waters and loss of important recreational and commercial resources. We know that much of the end-of-the-pipe sources of pollution have been regulated and reduced, so most of the nutrient pollution now comes from diffuse sources, and a large portion of that from agricultural sources. Currently, policy instruments to control these sources are mostly voluntary and incentive-based, and clearly are not fixing the problem. These instruments are under the jurisdictions of other statutes like the Farm Bill and EPA programs, and while the Algal Bill cannot do what these statutes are supposed to do, the provisions in the current draft can actually help in some very important ways. They can independently identify the geographies and the needed actions in these areas, and then measure and report progress from the ecosystem perspective. As we all know, what gets measured and reported gets done. However, we're not reporting at the right scale or in the right context to influence the impacts of hypoxia and harmful algal blooms. I've outlined some recommendations for the reauthorization in my written statement and will only emphasize one here. The current draft calls for a report on the progress of the Gulf Action Plan 2 years after enactment of the reauthorization and 5 years, every 5 years thereafter. This system has been studied for decades. The action plan has been in place since 2001. So I recommend the task force report progress 1 year after an enactment and every 2 years thereafter. But reporting should be focused at scales that matter. For example, the report should include details on the specific management metrics and expenditures and updates on environmental conditions at sub-basin or state levels. These reports should be matched up with USGS estimates of nutrient contributions from these subbasins in these states to ensure that the actions and the management that are taking place are actually targeted in the areas that matter most. The biennial reports from the regional plan should also follow this approach. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership in reauthorizing the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Act. Conditions in our nation's coastal and Great Lakes waters have unfortunately not improved in the past 10 years since the original enactment. In some cases, like Lake Erie, have gotten worse. It's time to increase implementation accountability and to ensure we have the research and monitoring programs in place to track progress. This bill is an important step in that direction, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment on it. And that ends my testimony. Thank you.
Outstanding testimony. I thank you. By the way, the haste with which I began a hearing was an example of how seriously I take this, not any short-sightedness on it. I wanted to hear from you folks, and your testimony was certainly worthwhile. Indeed, I wish every colleague and many people in the country could hear it. remember when I first moved to a community once, I'm a whitewater kayaker, and I go into lakes and practice rolling my boat. I'm flipping my boat over, and I'm realizing there's nobody else on this lake. I paddled to shore, and there's a little inland lake, city lake, and I said, why is nobody out here? He said, oh, because that water's really unhealthy for you. And the idea that water in a lake could kill you and kill your pets is really an alien idea to us. It just doesn't seem right, and yet it's clearly the case. And if it doesn't kill you, it can permanently remove your hippocampi, which is a bad deal as a neuropsychologist, I know. And so questions then. First of all, the suggestions are well taken. It sounds like the elements that were prescribed in the prior legislation you find important. To be perfectly honest, we kind of took those for granted and said they'll continue. You feel a need to specify that because you feel they're valuable. Sometimes we get the reverse feedback on this committee and other committees here. Don't over-direct us. They were included in prior bills precisely because testimony suggested they were important, and we assume they'll continue, but we will make that explicit because there seems to be unanimity. I think the point's well taken also on the issue of we have studied a lot of this, and it is time to take action, I think, and certainly to report on that action in a more timely manner and measure that, and I applaud the recommendations for improved monitoring, both, I think, in the freshwater upstream as well as the downstream area. I want to, at this point, invite my colleague, Connie Mack, who has been a champion of this, given his residence in Florida, and ask unanimous consent that Representative Mack join us on the dais. Also, Representative Mack and Mr. Delahunt from Massachusetts both have comments, statements they'd like to introduce into the record. Would ask unanimous consent. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I'll recognize myself for a few more minutes, and then Mr. Inglis, and then proceed in questioning as time allows. I want to make one thing clear, that make sure my understanding is correct on the case of normal filtration of water. As a backpacker and a climber, I'm used to carrying a water filter with me, and you filter out the protozoan, whatnot. But you don't filter out the toxin. Is that correct? So if there were a mountain lake, which there are in Oregon, where when you get to the lake, there's a sign that says, caution, there's blue-green algae here. If water's coming out of that lake and I filter that water, am I still getting the toxin potential, even if I'm not getting the algae per se?
One of the issues there is if the toxin is in the algae, then your filter will be very effective. But if the toxin is released from the cells, it will go straight through. That's true for boiling, too. We quite often boil our cells to release the toxins because it's a very easy way to get it into the water so that we can work with it. So that's not, a boil water advisory, for example, is meaningless when you start talking about things like microsystems.
That's what I thought. I think it's so important to help the public understand this, that your normal defenses against this don't work. Filtering, boiling, iodine, to my knowledge, doesn't work. Clorox, because it's a chemical toxin that's released from the organisms. Is that accurate?
That's pretty much true. A lot of the basic technologies that we would normally use in water treatment are not very effective for freshwater.
And that's also the case with the fish or the shellfish, right? Mr. Ayres, if you close a beach, it's not, somebody can't say, well, I'm going to cook the razor clams.
Exactly. You can't cook it out of the clams. You can't freeze it out of them. You just simply have to wait for them to naturally purge themselves of that toxin. Yeah, exactly. You cannot treat it in any way.
This issue of dead zones is profoundly troubling, and I'm glad you raised it, Dr. Scavia. Expanding from everything I hear. By the way, Puget Sound and Hood Canal, we've got a major problem, increasing zone off of Oregon. It seems in most areas they're expanding, not diminishing. Is that accurate?
That is true. In areas where we've had have the dead zones, the hypoxic areas, those areas are getting larger in many cases, and we're seeing more estuarine systems having that. But the study that was done between 2003 and 2007 showed that there was no improvement, and the forecasts from the experts that were involved were expecting it to get worse in about 2/3 of the estuaries.
In both the freshwater and the marine environments, the culprit, at least a prime suspect, if not known culprit, maybe known, tell me if I'm wrong, it seems to be nutrient sources, nitrogen and phosphates, if I'm under phosphorus. To what extent does acidification play a role, or temperature change play a role as well? I mean, lay those out for us a little bit, in both environments, if you would.
Well, I'll take a stab at the freshwater. You're exactly right. The prime culprits are nutrients coming in through the watershed. Acidification probably has very little, if no, effect on dead zones. Already forgot what your
Temperature.
Oh, temperature. Temperature is going to be a much trickier issue because associated with rising temperatures are often changes in weather patterns, which then lead to increased nutrients. Many of these organisms grow better under higher temperatures, so you'd expect that to also be a problem. And temperatures also lead to a more stable water column in many cases, which also leads to algal growth. So it's going to be sort of a tricky issue there, but it's
Great. Excellent testimony. I will close by, and I'll ask another round if I get time. You know, one of the great paradoxes of this is you hear your testimony, you know the importance of it, and yet to try to get the public fired up about this. Well, and actually, we did a radio interview on this week, and we said, well, maybe we should talk about algal blooms. And the fear was they're going to say, what's he talking about? Algae. And, well, it can kill you. Badly, it can kill you. I love the name. I decided if I was an ultimate fighter, one of those guys, I would like the name. What was it? Severe death factor? That'd be
fast death factor, very fast death factor.
With that, I recognize my friend and colleague, Mr. Inglis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Magnum, I was wondering about the control and mitigation technologies that are currently employed when HAB or hypoxia events are detected, and who decides what technology is used, and what's the decision protocol for making those decisions about the control and mitigation approaches?
Well, we define control as actually methods that you would use to suppress a bloom once it is present. Mm-hmm. And mitigation is more in the realm of warning people that a bloom is there and making sure they don't eat shellfish or come in contact with the water and get sick. As Dr. Anderson mentioned a little bit about these techniques, especially the control techniques, are not very well advanced, and that's one of the reasons why we've initiated this prevention, control, and mitigation program to get more research dollars applied to that. They can include techniques like spreading of clay, which is a very common technique in the Far East around aquaculture facilities. They coagulate the bloom and it settles out. They can include things like viruses or bacteria, disease agents that are put out, just like we do for various infestations in forests, introduce bacteria to control caterpillar growth. So those, are some of the aspects of those programs that really require additional research. And one of the big mitigation areas of research is this forecasting, where we give people warning, or resource managers warning, so that a Dan Ayres can have much more lead time in the decisions he has to make in terms of opening or closing a beach for razor clams, or the forecast that we issued through Don Anderson's research in New England this year that gave the managers there a heads up that they would need to gear up and have more staff on board in order to deal with a red tide, big red tide, which in fact did come, and they were very appreciative of that advance warning, and that allowed them to mitigate the impacts.
Who is it that makes the decision, and who makes the call on those kind of what course to pursue?
Most of the decisions on the front lines are state resource managers. Again, those folks like a Dan Ayres, a shellfish manager, public health official. Some of that is made at the county level. County health officials are empowered with closing water bodies. We've seen that happen in certain areas, especially beach closures, water contact recreation. So it's usually at the state and local level where those decisions are made, but those are the same people that lack the tools and the resources to support those decisions, and that's what we're trying to provide to them.
Great, thanks. And Dr. Anderson, why is there so little research into control and mitigation?
Well, I tried to address that in my written testimony. I even have an annex there, which is telling because it's a commentary I wrote in the journal Nature more than 10 years ago about that exact question. Why is it that progress is so slow? And as I say, we are not that much further along. The answers are several, and one of them truly is that that without a targeted program that has money explicitly and specifically for, let's say, bloom control, then scientists will tend to propose more safe research, things that are fundamental science that build on what they've done before. It is my own lab, I put an entire PhD into the use of clay to control these red tide organisms, and that student has struggled to find funding as he moved along. He's actually left the field. It's very, very sad to say that. But it's as much as that seems like where the money should be coming, it has been difficult to get funding for actual transitioning of these lab technologies to the field. And part of it is also then that we have permitting issues, and scientists, I guess we're just not used to having to say, in order to do this particular line of research, I need to go get permits from the state, from the Corps of Engineers, from the EPA. I need to do all these things. They're all going to ask for more data, and that tends to slow down progress dramatically. So there's a number of steps that I think can be alleviated by this program that we propose, this PCM HAB program, because it has development stages, developing the technologies, and it has demonstration and transitioning, so that you take something all the way and with substantial resources for all of those steps.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Inglis. Mr. Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also want to thank the ranking member for having me and letting me join today. And I also want to thank all of you for being here and your testimony. First of all, a little bit about me, I guess, and why I have an interest in this. But I grew up in Southwest Florida, Fort Myers, where I spent most of my childhood when I wasn't in school and in sports, but at the beach, on the water, enjoying fishing and water skiing and just enjoying the outdoors in Southwest Florida. And one of the main economic drivers in Southwest Florida is people coming down to come to the beach and have a little vacation and rest and relaxation. I also have a cousin who works at Woods Hole as a scientist. And we were talking one day when I decided that I was going to run for Congress, we were talking about red tide. Frankly, we were talking about it because we were out at the beach.
He didn't mean that in a political sense, of course.
Yeah. We were at the beach and we were talking about how, again, growing up, we would have red tide blooms, I guess you'll call it, that would come around once a year, sometime in August, last for 4 to 7, maybe 10 days, and that was it. And now we see red tide blooms that are off the coast of Florida that will last 13, 14 months straight. And so we started talking about things that we thought we could focus on and how to make the process a little bit better. And a couple of the things that we talked about and that I think are very important, and I want to, again, commend the committee for taking this up and trying to move forward with legislation that I think will have a huge impact. But one, we wanted to see if there was a way to stop duplication of research, because funding is so limited that if there is a peer review organization, a group that can look at the research that's being done, who is looking to get research dollars, we would have some mechanism to ensure that we're not duplicating of research. And for me, having been in politics a little bit before I even ran for this office, you know, all of us want to try to bring home those dollars to our district. So for me, Florida Gulf Coast University or Mote Marine, you know, we all end up finding ourselves trying to get those dollars for home so we can go back home and say we're trying to do something to help. But in the long run, is that really helping us further research into red tide if we're splitting up the available funds and really not having a consistent funding mechanism? So the peer review process was important, not duplicating research, consistency of funding, and I'm sure that's something all of you deal with. You'll have, Mr. Chairman, as you know, you'll have research projects that will be moving along nicely, and then funds run out, and they have to stop. And so that stop and then starting and stopping and starting hinders the progress made in research. And the last thing that we talked about was a reporting process. That right now there's so much reporting requirements that I'm not saying that we should do away with reporting at all. What I'm suggesting is we need to do a better job of streamlining those reports so you can really spend more time doing the research, spend less resources in doing the reports that are required, but at the same time, given the committee of oversight, given those who need to have the information to determine whether or not we're being successful and if what changes might need to be made. So these have been the thought process and the ideas that that I've had for some time, and I'm very pleased that the committee is moving forward this, Mr. Chairman. And I just wanted to, if I could make one other statement. We talk a lot about mitigation. We talk a lot about, you know, what can we do and how nutrients have really kind of pumped up and kind of, you know, energized these events. We still need to get back to trying to figure out what causes it in the first place. And we recognize that the red tide events that happen in the Gulf of Mexico will be different than what happens in the inland waterways. But if we solely focus our energies, Mr. Chairman, on just how to mitigate and warn people, I think we're missing the point. Really what we need to do is try to find out how it starts. And that is going to give us the best place to start with how to control it. And then I'll end with this, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your patience. But someone said, who makes the call? I think maybe it was the ranking member. Who makes the call at closing the beach? And I wrote a note down to myself, the one who drew the short straw. Because that person is never the popular one, although it is very important for the safety of our community. So again, Mr. Chairman, I want to congratulate you on your efforts in this legislation. And again, I want to thank the panelists for being here.
I want to thank the gentleman for his comments and his initiative on this. He's been a champion of this along. We've got, for an issue that, as I mentioned earlier, is not sort of a politically, you know, if you do a poll, this is not going to come up on most people's radar screen very high. But for areas like Mr. Mack's, that of his childhood and his current district, and parts of mine, this is a profoundly important issue, and it deserves the kind of attention it's gotten. And again, I acknowledge Mr. Ayres, Ms. Castor as well. And I want to follow up a little bit on a couple of the points Mr. Mack made. Let me talk for just a second about the economics of it. He talked about the impact on his district and on his state. Repeat for us real quickly the economic costs, the best estimate of economic costs we've got in terms of both hypoxia and harmful algal blooms. Do we have any? I mean, in our state, Mr. Ayres, you threw out some numbers. Dr. Magnan?
Well, yeah. I mean, I threw out some numbers, and it depends on the fishery that's being affected. We do have NOAA recently funded a study on the razor clam fishery specifically and what would be lost. And that number was much higher than we would have expected, in the neighborhood of $16 million to the coastal economy. And that's to these small communities that you know so well. $16 million to the state's economy is not a big deal, but to these, well, I don't know, Governor Gregoire may disagree, but to our small coastal communities, that's a big hit to them. So it really depends on the scale you want to look at and how that plays out. But it is a big...
The local hotel owners tell me it's their season.
Yeah, exactly.
You're out at our coastal area. You know, you could rent your garage when the clam season.
And you're right. I mean, it's not a big deal on people's radar screen until it doesn't happen. And then when it doesn't happen and they realize what they don't have.
That raises the other side of the issue, and I think I know the answer to this, and I'm going to guess the answer is more. But if the question were, what do you think are necessary, or other than just something more, what kind of funding levels do you think? And let's assume that we add some of the kind of intervention approaches, control remediation strategies, some of the immediate response kind of things. What kind of numbers should we be talking about relative to what we've been spending on the research and control, et cetera? If we were to make a national effort commensurate with the importance of the issue for human health, aquatic health, and other issues. Any thoughts?
I'll take a partial shot at that, partially because I used to run the program that Rob runs, and he can't answer this question, so I will for him. I think the overall program focused on harmful algal blooms and hypoxia, the NOAA part of it, to fund the research, the prevention, the mitigation things, it needs to be at least $40 million a year. And that's actually not a lot more than what they're doing now, but I think that's the level we need to bring it up to. I don't know whether Dr. Anderson has additional from the pure mitigation side.
Not just from the pure mitigation side, but if you look at the back of the, we call it the RIDDT report, RDDTT, we actually tried to break this down into costs for EcoHab, for MERHAB, for PCM, and so forth, and we even broke it down into freshwater versus marine. And that's where you get up to these numbers that are $40 million a year and so forth. So that was at least our first shot at it.
A conscientious effort to say what's a realistic number.
Yes, and we do acknowledge that if we are going to try, for example, some of these control methods, some of them could be extraordinarily expensive, much more than we give out in a lot of these targeted research grants. If you're going to try to control a red tide over a few, let's say, square miles or so, it could be $1 million project just by itself. So on that prevention, on the control and mitigation side, the costs might go up the closer we get to demonstration projects.
To punctuate that, though, a little bit, you know, if you've got a couple of years ago when we had these hearings, we talked about municipal water supplies for major cities that had blue-green algae. And you can literally overnight have an all-hands-on-deck crisis situation where your community is instantly out of most of its water. And the costs of dealing with that and the lack of a remediation strategy, the lack of a treatment strategy can be, suddenly it's the most important thing on your mind is what you're going to do with that. And which segues a little bit, seem to be a little concern from Dr. Scavia, and we've heard it elsewhere, not to put you on the spot, Ms. Schwartz, but is EPA, what can EPA do better, let me phrase it that way, in the freshwater realm here? And not only the freshwater realm as freshwater per se, but as a contributor to the ultimate marine environment.
Well, I think there are certainly things we could be doing better. We are looking actively at different ways that we can be more effective in controlling non-point sources, in particular of nutrients. We are looking actually where, you know, most everybody else here has been talking about control and mitigation of the blooms themselves. Our focus has really been more on addressing the nutrients, getting to the sources, so that hopefully we would prevent the blooms from being at least as frequent or as serious as they are. And I would offer, although I don't have a figure to give you, that the figures that have been thrown around don't include the costs of prevention in that sense. We are working closely with USDA on a number of things, and I would urge you, in fact, as you're looking at your legislation, to think about the different agencies that really do need to participate, because, again, if you're going to get to the underlying causes, certainly USDA is a huge player. In the Gulf of Mexico, hypoxia, they are just about to announce some exciting new efforts to try to address the particular sources, or the hottest sources at least, in the upper Midwest, as well as along the Mississippi to address the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So we think that there's a need to bring everybody in. If you look at what we're going to be proposing shortly in the Chesapeake Bay. We have really looked very seriously. There's a huge nutrients and sediments issue there as well. We are looking very closely at what steps we can take, whether it's to increase the activities we regulate under the Clean Water Act, more CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, whether those numbers should come down in terms of how many animals are considered a regulated point source, looking at stormwater discharges, how those are regulated. Obviously, when we have permitting authority or the state has permitting authority, you can control what is released much more readily than when you don't have that authority, as is the case for most non-point sources.
And it seems from what you're saying earlier, and the generally sense seems to me that this non-point source issue is huge, especially with agriculture and urban runoff. Is that a fair appraisal? And that if you were to just do the pie chart kind of model of what percentage of the cause of, I mean, algal blooms have been here for a long time, and it's not just started now, but they seem to be worsening. They seem to be growing. So too with areas of hypoxia. It just seems to be a consensus may be a fair word, that these nutrient issues, much of it from non-point source, a substantial portion from ag, is a contributor and it's to the downstream consequences. Is that a fair portrayal? I'm not going to ask you to put a number on it, but a fair portrayal. So we've got to address that, how we deal with the non-point source. So, Mr. Mack, I'm going to have to leave shortly, but I want to give you a chance to follow up with any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess if I had to try to narrow this down, I think it's on one side, I think the committee and the Congress needs to find a way to ensure that the appropriate amount of funding is available and that we're not duplicating research, as I said, and that it's consistent. I guess I would love to hear from whoever would like to answer it, but how much of the research dollars that are available now are going to, or what percentage of it is going to actually trying to identify the not what makes the bloom larger, but how the bloom began in the first place. And I know that it's a little difficult. Of course, I'm interested in the Gulf of Mexico, but I know it's a little difficult because all of the algae blooms are different in different parts, so they may have different causes. But do we have a good understanding of that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because I didn't want to leave the impression that these programs that you've heard so much about, the EcoHab, prevention, control, mitigation, don't deal with that. In fact, they do. The EcoHab program is looking at the fundamental processes that generate these blooms. We need to understand that in order to prescribe some kind of a preventative solution. We would like to prevent as many of these blooms as possible. So the EcoHab program looks at that. The prevention, control, and mitigation. I talked about the control and mitigation because Representative Inglis asked me about that, but prevention is also, the P is prevention. That gets at, what is the cause and understanding that. And in your area in Florida, we have a huge project ongoing now to look at that. It's been a very controversial issue. A lot of people say we can't control it, we can only mitigate it. But we're putting in some large dollars, a multi-million-dollar grant now, to continue to investigate that question as to whether there are ways either to lessen the severity. Some people say that maybe we can't control the initiation, but when it comes inshore, some of the local sources of nutrient pollution enhance it and prolong it. So we're very much looking at that, as well as the economic impacts. You heard a little bit about that. We have sort of piecemeal information. We know it's big impacts in certain areas, in certain blooms, up to $50 million or more, but we don't have comprehensive numbers, and that economic impact will help guide where we put some of our effort in terms of research and on these issues as well.
Anybody else want to? Yes, Mr. Anderson.
The forecasts that we've been able to do in the Northeast region, and in fact with your cousin being actively involved in that, are based on exactly what you're looking for. We have identified the source of our blooms. We know that there are beds of these dormant cells in certain locations in the Gulf of Maine, and we have over the years learned that if we can map those out and count them, that gives us a very good indication of what the next year's red tide will be like. And so there we've identified the source and understand the linkage to the ultimate blooms. The challenge is, well, other than using that for forecasting, could we somehow use that information in an actual bloom control strategy? And that's where it truly becomes challenging. Because yes, there are mechanisms. In my lab, we actually mate toxic and non-toxic cells of this organism and produce a non-viable cell from that. It's like a sterile fruit fly. But the question to all of you would be, can you imagine me trying to propose to put an introduced organism into the Gulf of Maine in huge numbers to do this? The societal challenge of doing that is dramatic, even though the technology might suggest a way to step from that knowledge of the source to a control mechanism. And that's where we need to move forward, is to take that knowledge and that little bit of laboratory science and figure out a way to get it out into the field.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
One thing I'd like to point out is if you look at what's been done in the Gulf of Mexico, for the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone, Department of Interior, the USGS, actually did some mapping and some modeling. It's called the Sparrow model, and it actually shows the level of concentration provided to the Mississippi River. So you can actually identify where the largest contributions are coming for, both separately for nitrogen and for phosphorus, from within the basin. And that's something that we feel is really going to be helpful to us in order to target. Again, we're never going to have enough resources to take care of everything all at once, but to target the greatest sources. So we think work like that can be done. EPA is putting in probably about $4 to $5 million a year specifically on hypoxia and HAVs, both research and implementation activities. We have a lot of other efforts underway on nutrients more broadly, but it's without the ability to really target where the source is, and without some sort of regulatory or voluntary program to make sure that it's addressed, it's really hard to do much.
And Mr. Chairman, I know you've got to go, but I just wanted these events, these red tide events, can cripple communities like Sanibel Island, Florida. You get a algae bloom off of Sanibel, and it just has a devastating impact on the quality of life of the residents and tourism. And so, again, Mr. Chairman, I just want to commend you for your efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Mack. That's why we intend to try to move this legislation forward with alacrity. I appreciate the input of the panelists. We hope to incorporate many of your suggestions in the revision that we'll bring up for a markup hopefully soon. Thank you for your expertise and your work. The record of this hearing will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members and for answers to any follow-up questions the subcommittee may ask. The witnesses are again thanked for their expertise and their participation, and with that, the hearing stands adjourned. Thank you, Mr. Mack.